Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to AJ507 Ethics in Criminal Justice. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week's lecture, Chapter 13, is going to cover correctional professionals along with some of the different types of misconduct that can occur and some of the responses as it relates to that particular or whatever type of misconduct that we're going to be learning about in this chapter. So let's go ahead and jump right into our lecture for this week. So we want to be able to, what do we want to take away from the chapter? Well, explain the Zimbardo experiment and what it might imply for correctional professionals. This was a super interesting experiment, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes. We want to describe types of misconduct that can occur by correctional officers, including some of the typologies of misconduct. And a couple of authors by the name of Sorial and McCarthy are going to give us that information. We want to describe types of misconduct by community corrections professionals, some explanations for misconduct. So why does this misconduct occur? And then talk about and present some suggestions to decrease misconduct by correctional professionals. So there's a really cool video that you can watch right here, but this is what they call the Stanford experiment. So in 1971, Dr. Philip Zimbardo conducted a very infamous, if you will, experiment on the grounds of Stanford University designed to explore the effects of power, more so in a prison setting. Okay, so, and again, the other name for this Zimbardo experiment is the Stanford Prison Experiment. And in this experiment, college men were basically arbitrarily assigned to be correctional officers or inmates, and a mock prison was set up in the basement of a building on the grounds of Stanford University. And the changes in both groups were so profound that the experiment was actually canceled after 6 days. And again, you can go back to that video. But in that video, you're going to see that Zimbardo noted that about 1/3 of the correctional officers became extremely violent and brutal, authoritarian, and prisoners also became manipulative and exhibited signs of emotional distress and even mental breakdowns. So there was a lot that came out of this. Some of the inmate subjects became very docile and submissive, and some became manipulative. And again, those behavioral changes just were so profound that they ended up stopping the experiment. But the study itself illustrates the effect of a prison experience from both sides of the coin, right? From the possibility of becoming more authoritarian and demanding and even abusive on the guard side, to being manipulative or even submissive. It just kind of depends what your nature might be, but even on the inmate side. So it was a super interesting experiment. So take a look at it. And a lot of people thought that this experiment never really should have been done, but it really does show what can happen in a prison type environment. Now, McCarthy in 1991 and Sorial in 2009, they detailed the following types of corruption by correctional officers and other officials that are in correction. So they kind of gave us a list of some of these things that take place, right? So accepting gratuities, right? Free stuff for special consideration for legitimate purposes. Accepting gratuities for protection of illicit activities. Mistreatment or harassment or extortion of inmates. Mismanagement, meaning the kind of the prison industries, etc. and then miscellaneous abuse or other types of abuses that were kind of subcategorized, if you will. And Sorial in 2008 described different typologies of corruption as falling into a couple of different categories. And there's 3 definitions or categories. And we'll touch on them and we'll go into each one just a little bit deeper. But the first one would be what they call malfeasance, which is abusing authority for personal gain. So something like extortion or smuggling or theft. So that's misfeasance, I'm sorry. Malfeasance would be acts that violate authority. And then nonfeasance would be acts of omission, such as ignoring rule violators. So when we talk about acts of omission, basically not doing what you should be doing. Okay, so again, we'll go into these in a little bit more detail. So another author, also Brahms in 2001, described different types of prisoner abuses as malicious or purposeful abuse. Okay, and this type of abuse consists of excessive use of force, sexual harassment, theft and destruction of personal property, false disciplinary charges, intentional denial of medical care, failure to protect, racial abuse and harassment, excessive and humiliating strip searches. So this all falls under malicious or purposeful abuse. And next would be negligent abuse. So this could include things like negligent denial of medical care, failure to protect, lack of responsiveness, or negligent loss of property, or an inmate's mail, which we know is going to be super important to them, right? And then finally, the last of the 3 would be systemic or budgetary abuse. And, this type of abuse is kind of system-wide and refers to policies including overcrowding, inadequate medical care, systematic budget cutting, failure to protect, elimination of visits or other types of programs, and even things like co-payments or surcharges, and the use of isolation units. So a lot of different things for us to kind of consider. Again, we have McCarthy and Sorial's different types of abuse, and then we have Sorial again in 2009 describes those different definitions. Remember, misfeasance, malfeasance, and nonfeasance. And then, of course, we have, Brahms 2001, different types of prisoner abuse. So now we're going to talk a little bit about, how this actually tends to occur a little bit. So although there really is no research that supports this premise, if you will, a reading of a wide range of news reports, both current and historical, of corruption in corrections basically indicates that corruption, tends to occur in patterns. Okay. And that is, if there is, let's say, sexual misconduct, there's also smuggling. If there is physical abuse of inmates, then there are also other forms of mistreatment. It also appears that corruption tends to permeate levels of supervisors who end up protecting corrupt activities. So, cover-ups at the highest levels also occur, arguably not because the highest level administrators are involved directly, but more so because of long-term friendships between those involved and those who can protect them and or desire to keep illegal activities from being exposed to the public. So basically, these administrators don't want people to find out, or they're friends with these individuals, right? So, patterns of corruption, again, also seem to occur when there's a lack of resources, right? Including understaffing, deferred maintenance, leading to basically rundown facilities, and a seeming lack of care and attention from top management. So in a way, and this is just kind of interesting before we look at a couple of different states, one might describe this as, if you know the theory, the broken windows theory of corrections, though. In that when policies and procedures are ignored, when buildings fall into disrepair, and when relationships between inmates and correctional officers drift into unprofessional kind of, you know, familiarity or even animosity, then corruption or crime seems to present itself as well. And you know, the standard broken windows theory, if you recall, is if a neighborhood is left to, you know, get trash and graffiti and dirty and windows are broken and no one's paying attention to the area, etc., it gets more run down, then crime seems to kind of flourish to that area. So it's the same kind of analogy, right? So that's just kind of a super interesting theory. All right, so in a couple of the following sections, we're going to focus on a few states: California, Florida, and New York. And this really, and understand, this is not to portray these states, you know, as worse than others or indicate that there's no corruption in states that I'm not going to talk about, because that's not true. You know, indeed, it is noteworthy how similar scandals across the country are, you know, there are similar scandals across the country. They're everywhere. And no place is perfect, right? Drug and cell phone smuggling, assaults, sexual exploitation seem to occur with remarkable similarity across many different states and many different institutions. Okay, so again, we're just looking at these three typically because they are three of the largest. So that's one of the reasons that we're going to take a look at them. So let's start with California. So California's Department of Corrections has been in the past described as corrupt from the top down because investigations of wrongdoing seem to be thwarted by powerful union leaders. And the unions in the correction field, that is true, they are very powerful. The prison union in California is one of the strongest unions of any labor group in the state. Just a little bit of extra information. You know, in the 1990s gladiator fights and shootings of inmates in the yard at Corcoran led to federal indictments, and several officers were tried for, you know, killings and assaults, etc., but they were ultimately acquitted. And some argue that the union basically kind of tainted the jury pool because the union is so strong. And just a couple of pictures of different prisons as we talk. I'll kind of, you know, introduce some visual things for you to look at, whether it's going to be the prison we're talking about like Corcoran or other prisons as well. So you can kind of get the layout of different prison systems, because at the end of this lecture, we're going to talk about some different types of prisons, okay? Now, during legislative hearings about a Folsom prison riot that was said by some to have originated through correctional officers conspiring with one of the gangs, one legislator received death threats and witnesses were placed into protective custody. And the riot and the cover-up of this eventually led to the suicide of an officer who attempted to thwart or stop the riot, but was then stopped by a supervisor. And several wardens and assistant wardens ended up resigning, took early retirement, or were fired. And several officers were also fired as a result of this particular incident at Folsom. And again, just some pictures. And here's Folsom, a picture. There's 2 yards here. There's an upper yard and a lower yard. And you can see here, this is the lower yard. You can actually even see they kind of named it with some rocks here. So this is Folsom Prison. Okay. And a couple of other pictures for you to take a look at. All right. So the career of, and we're still talking about California, Donald DJ Vodica, okay, encompassed the rapid expansion of the prison system. For 16 years, he was a prison guard in California's highest security prisons, serving meals to gang leaders, serial killers in lockdown cells, and patrolling the exercise yards filled with violent felons while unarmed and outnumbered, let's say 1,000 to 2. And yeah, the staffing levels are not always that great in prisons. And he belonged to an elite unit called the Investigative Services Unit, or Internal Affairs, those that investigate their own. Every department typically has their own, not just in prisons, but in policing. So Internal Affairs, responsible for solving crimes inside the walls, right? And investigating their own individuals as well. And he was a decorated veteran officer. At the end of the day, he became the largest whistleblower, someone who told the truth about things, right? To uncover a group of rogue prison guards who called themselves the Green Wall. And you can see the book that he wrote here called The Green Wall, a prison guard struggle to expose the code of silence in the largest prison system in the United States. So a super good book. I would highly recommend it if you're a reader. But this is what he did. And, as a result of a lot of these things that have taken place, CDCR, which is the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, they basically had formed a centralized internal affairs office that investigates allegations of wrongdoing, but there's also a state office of the Inspector General that unit also performs reviews of those CDCR investigations and prepares reviews at the requests of legislature. So there are some evaluation reports, and there are oversight committees, if you will. So the Office of Inspector General basically has oversight and periodically looks at and reviews the investigations that are conducted by CDCR personnel, if that makes any sense. Okay, so kind of moving on a little bit. So now we're moving to some issues that happened at the High Desert State Prison in Susanville in 2015. Reports of systematic abuse, provoking fights between inmates, strip searches, meaning making people stand there naked, and a lot of profane, unnecessary language. And the guards themselves, basically self-protection and loyalty to the prison was really one of the ways to kind of keep their group together, right? Now, as described earlier, California has drastically reduced its prison population due to the court holding in a case called Brown versus Plata and the Realignment Act. And this resulted in many more inmates in county jails rather than prisons. And overcrowding in California really isn't a secret, right? We know that there's been overcrowding for quite a long time. And this is the result of that. And you can look at the photos to kind of take a look at this. Now, the Los Angeles County Jail has been cited in the past by advocates, inmates, attorneys, etc., and even staff members as a place where widespread abuse has been known to occur. And the ACLU collected over 70 statements by prisoners, chaplains, teachers, civilian staff, and even deputies, and submitted them to the court in the case of Rutherford versus Baca back in 2006. And most of the abuse in this particular case took place on the third floor of the jail. And this group that worked on the third floor was kind of known as a gang-like group who used kind of hand signs and called themselves the 3,000 Boys for the third floor, okay? And in later court filings, they were described as having tattoos of bones on the back of their necks and awarding points for the breaking of people's bones. Now, what I do want you to know that although I'm highlighting some of these cases, they're extremely few and far between. But I do want to make sure that we bring to light that there have been these abuses that have happened in prisons, and we know that a lot of prisons this is still happening. Okay, maybe not to the degree that I'm discussing, but we know that things do take place, right? Because you're dealing with people. Whenever you deal with people, you're going to have issues at some particular point. Nothing is going to be perfect. But I don't want you to get the idea that this is an everyday occurrence. but I want you to know that these things take place. Now, kind of moving on, the LA County Jail had already been under a federal monitor for 12 years for its treatment of mentally ill inmates. And a county blue ribbon panel created after the ACL report was created basically issued a report in 2012 that said that Sheriff Baca at that time and his assistants had created an environment where deputies believed it was acceptable to use physical beatings and humiliation, etc., to control inmates and then to cover up the different types of abuses. Now, the most bizarre chapter in this whole case occurred in 2011 when the FBI engineered an undercover operation by paying a corrupt correctional officer to smuggle a cell phone to a prisoner informant who was supposed to collect evidence of brutality in the jail with that phone. And when the cell phone was discovered and the prisoner informant told deputies he was working with the FBI, he was then prevented from communicating with his FBI handler. So basically, those employees at the jail tried to hide this informant, this prisoner, right? Which we know at the end of the day wasn't going to work. So the FBI filed a writ to produce the particular inmate, but the court order somehow got lost, which is another game that those particular individuals were playing at the time. And they hid the prisoner. They continued to hide the prisoner. Now, recordings of sheriff's deputies were seized as evidence, and 2 deputies tried to intimidate an FBI agent in order to have the agent provide information on the investigation. You can see how far deep this case actually goes, right? So, after all of this happened, the LASO, the Sheriff Lee Baca, and the Assistant Sheriff Paul Tanaka basically were investigated by the FBI, and this is in 2013. And as a result of this investigation, 18 officers and supervisors were arrested under 4 different grand jury indictments on a bunch of different charges. And then in 2014, the Los Angeles County Jail agreed to a federal consent decree, meaning that they would allow the Department of Justice to monitor them, and they had certain conditions that they had to meet, etc. And you can see what happened here. So this is an article that's dated May 12th, 2017, and you can see former LA County Sheriff Lee Baca sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for leading the scheme to obstruct the investigation into the LA County Jail. So this is kind of the conclusion, if you will, of what happened. Paul Tanaka, the former number 2 in the Sheriff's Department, sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for obstructing federal investigations into misconduct at the county jail. And this was an article you can see that was Monday, June 27th in 2016. And then at one particular point, federal judges ordered body cameras to start being used in 5 different state prisons as a result of misconduct. So again, while a lot of things go correct in the environments here in prison systems, there are times where there's going to be abuse and officers overstepping their bounds, etc. And you can see some of the outcomes here. All right, so what about Florida? So with 20,000 employees and 100,000 inmates, Florida's prison system is the 3rd largest in the country after California and Texas, with one of the highest rates of imprisonment. And, so there, federal courts, when they took a look at Florida's prison system, did cite 8th Amendment violations. And basically they ended up overseeing this particular state prison for more than 20 years, starting in the mid-70s, ordering legislators to relieve overcrowding, to provide adequate medical and health care. And a lot of prisons are typically overcrowded because the United States, we believe in, or the majority of people believe in, incarceration. Okay, so when we've kind of discussed that over different weeks. Now, James Crosby, the Secretary of Corrections System at that time, was forced to resign in 2006, and he ended up in federal prison for bribery. And as a result, the investigation led to criminal charges against more than 24 other employees for things like, abusive staff and cover up of assaults, etc. And there were also a series of inmate deaths. So these are things that were happening in Florida at that time. Now, in 2014 and 2015, the Miami Herald's investigative series of the Florida's prison system by a reporter by the name of Julie Brown exposed a seemingly corrupt system that was chronically underfunded and was basically rife with abuse and cover-ups, meaning that it was happening frequently. And in 2014, the Department of Justice indicated that they would be investigating the prison system for civil rights violations. And after this Miami Herald report came out in 2014, 32 correctional officers were fired as a result. So you can see that this happens around the United States. It's not necessarily just California or any one place. Now, in 2015, Julie Jones, who had been a state law officer for a little over 30 years and who was most recently the director of the Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles, was appointed secretary to the Corrections Department, and she ended up firing 44 correctional officers and supervisors in her first year. And by March of 2016, Jones had fired or forced a little over 1,000 additional people to resign. Now, you're probably thinking, well, why does this stuff even happen? Well, some of the reasons that were kind of looked at as far as the issues that were happening in Florida, and it's no different than some of the other states, would be the lack of positions, meaning there's not enough officers to really handle things. And if you don't have enough people, what happens is you start to cut corners. And when you cut corners, then you start to, bad things happen, right? You can't pay attention to everything, so you try to figure out where you can cut corners. Low pay, meaning you may just get individuals that they're not looking for a long-term career. They just need some money, and they jump into this as more of a job rather than a career. So the pay is low, and it could be an incentive to become involved in some type of illegal activity to make up the difference for what you're not making in pay, right? Bad policies, meaning that just the policies hadn't been updated in so long that they were just not, they weren't with the times, if you will. And then finally, lack of technology. Working with a lot of the different old systems, whether they were lacking cameras or communication devices or any of those things, any type of lack of technology where they had to do everything kind of old school. So these are some of the things that have come up as a result of the Florida issues, but they are very applicable to a lot of the other states as well. And then finally, we'll end up talking about the three. We'll finish up with New York. So, the New York Department of Corrections and Community Services they've had a series of scandals in recent years, not the least of which was the escape from Clinton prison by 2 prisoners aided by staff members and the negligence of others. Okay, so not only did he have staff members help these individuals, but the negligence of others, meaning the others not doing their job. And as a result, a 150-page report by the State Inspector General uncovered several different issues that kind of related to this. And I put 2 documents in here. This is the one that they're talking about as far as the escape of inmates. Okay, and then here was another kind of updated report in 2019. So you can take a look at these if you want to, but I just wanted to throw those in there. And realistically, no matter which state we're talking about, only a strong oversight and disciplined department has any chance of changing a culture where abuse of inmates is accepted, right? So we could talk a lot about all of these different things that are taking place, but without strong policy and strong oversight, etc., and holding those individuals accountable, are you going to be able to have a culture that changes to the better, right? things that are acceptable versus the culture of abuse. But if we go back to some of these things and we look at these things right here, lack of positions, low pay, bad policy, lack of technology, these are contributing factors to a lot of these issues that are happening, as I said. Now with New York, it's kind of interesting because they have a 20,000 member union, which has extreme political power. Okay. And because of that, really, it's really hard for things to change there. And supervisors really have almost no control over dealing with problem officers, not just discipline, but even moving them out. And many argue that the union protection here has allowed this culture of kind of abuse or brutality, and have basically allowed some bad officers to avoid discipline because of the strength of and the political power of the union, right? And that can really make sense. So, again, as we talked about these three different states, understand that there are a lot of things that contribute or that can contribute to, abuse in the correction system. So kind of keeping in the same area, because we're talking about correctional professionals, but moving away from the actual correctional officer, what about the treatment professionals? So most news items and academic articles describe misconduct in prisons by correctional officers, right? And that's typically what comes out. But there are instances where people like counselors and other treatment professionals inside of the correctional system engage in misconduct. Sometimes they smuggle in contraband. Sometimes they coerce inmates or engage in sexual activity with inmates. And the most common issue, though, is not providing the services that inmates are actually legally entitled to. And that really is kind of, the big one, right? Not providing those things that people are really entitled to. And, like law enforcement's attitude towards certain segments of society, treatment professionals in corrections sometimes develop that same kind of attitude that all inmates are, liars or crooks or addicts, and they don't deserve those basic services. And the trouble really with this line of reasoning, besides the fact that it's contrary to that professional's duty, if you will, is that once some are kind of perceived as outside the bounds of professional duties, it's really easy to ignore those duties and the respect for everybody, right? So, again, while most news items describe misconduct in prisons, there are also examples of, ethical misconduct and criminal acts by community corrections professionals as well. So we're not just talking about treatment professionals, we're now kind of talking about those community corrections professionals, interacting with parolees and probationers in the community can present officers with opportunities for corruption. So there really are a lot of things that can happen even with community corrections. A 2013 Denver Post review of basically parole records discovered a lot of fundamental errors in a lot of different cases, in about 60% of the cases. And the review showed that parole officers left parolees on their caseload even after repeated failures to appear. And in one case, a parolee had missed therapy sessions or failed a drug test 49 times and was arrested twice, and the parole officer still hadn't filed any type of violation report. So again, there's a lot of things as it relates to all the different positions. So in response to, scandals, there has been a proposal to fund body cameras for probation officers, etc., to protect them from allegations that they, plant evidence or steal items from probationers' homes and different things like that. So, there are some ethical issues when it comes to, probation and parole. And we kind of talked about that. There's another case I can cite in 2013, 4 Texas parole officers were arrested after a year-long investigation into parole officers taking bribes to ignore drug trafficking and other illegal activities by parolees. So a lot of different things, right? And one of the interesting things to talk about here would be a particular case. And here's an ethical issue. Should probation officers partner with law enforcement to search a probationer's house? And you can actually look at the case. It's Griffin versus Wisconsin in 1987. It's on page 415 and 416 in your textbook. And, in this particular case, just to kind of give you a little bit of a heads up, the Supreme Court upheld warrantless searches of probationers' homes under what they call a special needs analysis. So specifically, the court held that probationers were under a restricted form of liberty and that probation officers had special duties of supervision that justified the intrusion of privacy. Okay, but that's the probation officer themselves. What about bringing a police officer with the probation officer, right? So, when you look at this case from an ethical perspective, as with all ethical issues, we would begin by examining the issue considering law, policy, and then ethics. If there's no law that prohibits the practice and the policy of the agency allows it, then we look at the inherent right or wrongness of the action. Okay, we're talking about ethics. Remember, searches are an invasion of privacy of the offender, but also the offender's family members. So if he or she lives with a relative or friend, those individuals have basically less Fourth Amendment protections than other citizens merely because of their association with that person, right? Now, on the other hand, searches by probation officers may uncover contraband, including weapons. So one might imagine that they may prevent serious violent crimes. And as we basically have discussed many times previously, the phrase utilitarianism would weigh the costs and benefits of this particular practice. Now, in this case that we're talking about, it seems as if the benefit of probation over prison for the offender outweighs the invasion of privacy. Okay? So, but at the end of the day, why was the search done and why would a police officer need to go? So even the probation officer, if they just search because they can to kind of harass somebody or whatever, that's really not the proper way to do it, right? But if the searches are done for other, ulterior motives, etc., we'd have to look at that. If there's information that the offender is involved in something and you're just doing a compliance check, that's perfectly fine, of course. But if you have an ulterior motive, then maybe that's not really ethical. So I'm just kind of throwing this out for you to think about. Take a look at the case, and we can talk a little bit more about it. But it's a really good case to think about. And the question is, again, should probation officers partner with law enforcement to search a probation officer's or a probationer's house? All right, so we're right about the 38-minute mark, so this would be a good time to take a break. And this link is live right here too, so if you wanted to go there and look at this case, you could. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about community corrections, and we'll come back with part 2.